Hey everyone, this is going to be the recitation going through React Router Basic Nav, and then potentially some other stuff, time willing. So I have over here on my left side the React Router Basic Nav project. I've already run yarn install to not delay any of your time, but I do want to show y'all I'm running yarn start, a very important part of any React project is getting that to actually show up in our browser. And we'll go ahead and start the development server and then take a look at our project. I do not want Chrome, and I'll just go ahead and open that up in Firefox. While that is loading, let's look at our project. So in our source, the React project really starts in index.js. That's where things get hooked up. And generally in here is where we want to do any kind of setup that we need for our project. So, oh, Zoom pop-up, you drive me crazy. So the first thing we want to do is hook our project up to React Router. And the way we do that is by wrapping our app component, the root component that we render on our page, inside of a special component provided to us by React Router. So what we're going to do here is we are going to import that. So I'm going to import browser router as router from React Router DOM. And that doesn't do anything because all we did was import this, but I want to spend a little bit of time on this syntax. When we're doing a named import like this, we can rename the component or whatever we're importing by writing as and then the new name. This is useful for when it's not really relevant to me that this is the browser router, or if we're going to have name collisions, which you might have experienced when you were using a UI library like Semantic UI, where they use very general terms for their components, like card, and you might have already written a component named card. And so this is a way that we can rename components so that we don't run into naming conflicts, because we can't have two variables with the same name. I can continue to add commas and then import other things from this, and I can even rename them as I want to. This is just our named import syntax when we want to rename it. So now I want to hook up my root component, my app, to the router. So I'm going to wrap this app in this router component and just get that formatted the way I like to. And so now we're going to be able to use the router within our component. And our project talked about opening our React DevTools, which is an extension we can install that will let us kind of inspect our app in this familiar, element view, but using our React components. And we'll see some weird stuff going on. First, we have our browser router component, and then we have our router. And we see this weird component called router.provider. We'll talk about that more when we get to the context API. But basically, as far as we're currently aware, there's only one way to pass data to our components, and that's through giving them props from their direct parent component. We're going to learn about ways to pass data, between components non-linearly. And that's what they're doing here. This is how they can hook up all of our apps to the same match and history information. But if we look in here, we see that, we have these props coming through, history, location, match, and we don't really have to understand the implementation details of this. We just need to know how to use it. If you're curious, you can always look at the source code for this project. It's open source. You can learn a lot by reading the source code for these various projects, even if you don't understand all of it. So let's go ahead and try to get this working. So we're going to take a trip over to app.js, which is where our stuff happens. So we have these different components: home, about, contact, and navigation. Navigation is what's currently being rendered to our screen with the links to these various things. What I'm going to do is I want to hook up the components that we want to render. So I'm going to import route from React Router DOM, and that's what's going to let me choose to render these components on different routes. I'm going to do that by giving it a route, specifying a path. We're going to do home, so I'm just going to give it the root, the top level slash, and then I'm going to set my component path equal to the component that I want to render. So if I do this, now I should see home showing up, which is great. I can do the same thing with my two other components. Let me add a contact here, and let me do the same thing with about. Ooh, spelling is hard. Alright, I'm going to put those in order like that. And so now, if I visit a slash about, we should see about show up, but we also see home show up. That's because route works like an if statement. It says if the path matches, then render this component. It doesn't prevent any other components from being rendered. It just says render this one if the path matches. By default, it's going to try to match a partial, the start of the path. And this is what allows us to do things like nested routing. Because I can go within the about component and add additional layers of routing, and it's still going to render my about component for me, which is exactly what we want in most cases. But when we render a component at the root level, at this top level slash, then it's going to show up in all of the other places. What we can do is add a prompt called exact. And when we do this, it will only render the component if the path matches exactly. That's how we're going to prevent home from showing up when we're rendering all of these different components. Now, I've seen some people be confused about what's happening here because this looks strange. This looks like a special keyword. It's actually just a prop, like anything else. But when we specify a prop name and don't give it a value, it defaults to true. So this is the same thing as me doing this. Exact same thing. But we can just take a little shortcut and not include the value, and React knows what we want to do. That's actually the same way that attributes work in normal HTML. If you remember adding things like async or defer to our script tags, those are just attributes we aren't specifying the value of, and they default to, true. So,
Henry, is that the same thing as writing route exact path equals?
Is there a prop that does that? Is there a prop like this?
No.
Like just having these in the different order? Yes, this is exactly the same. These are props. They're like named arguments. We can put them in any order we want, So I can put this before, I can put this after, and when we render this route, which is a component, it takes props just like any other component, it will get all of these props in its props object and then process them however it chooses. So the order here does not matter. Whatever way we want to put this, it's going to work. So exact, just another prop. All right, any questions with this? I'm going to line these up while I'm waiting. Look at that. Beautiful. All right, now I want to implement the links. So what I can do is I can go where I've defined these defined the navigation component and make these links actually work good. Because as it stands right now, they're not doing much of anything. So let's go into components and then find our navigation component. So we don't want to use anchor tags inside of React because they'll cause our browser to navigate to a brand new URL, which is going to cause them to reload the page. And the whole point of client-side routing is that it's handled entirely within our JavaScript. They're never actually leaving our page and reloading a new one. That allows us to give great responsiveness because there's going to be no load time except for any data, we need to fetch from the API or, render our JavaScript. So we don't want them reloading the whole page. The main downside of single page applications is the initial page load is slow because they're downloading the entire bundle of JavaScript that composes our React application. So we get a slow initial loading time, but great responsiveness once we're in there. So we really want to limit the number of times they're going to have to load our page. And we do that with another tag from React Router DOM. This one is called link. So if I import link from React Router DOM, I can use it to replace these A tags. Instead of giving it an href, we give it a prop called to, and that specifies where we want this link to go to. So in the case of the home link, I just want it to go to the root, that top level slash. That's perfect. And I can continue doing these for the other routes. And here I'm going to set the to prop to be about. I want to talk about what's happening here. So this will work, but we have to be careful in the way we're setting this to. Because the way this is going to be interpreted is it's just going to add about to the end of where we currently are, to the end of our current URL. So if I go to test and then I click on about, you'll see the URL has now changed to test/about. Right? It didn't navigate us to the top level /about. This is a relative link, which is useful in a lot of cases, when we're doing things like nested routes, but it is not something I want here. I want to go to the top level about. I want to match what my route is inside of my app.js. So I need this slash here, if that's where I want it to go. I can do the same thing with contact. And so now I should be able to navigate to all of these, and they will work. All right. Any questions with doing this?
I had a question, Henry.
Mm-hmm.
Could you touch upon the difference between links and nav links?
Yeah, absolutely. We have another component that we can import from React Router DOM called a nav link. And it's pretty much a drop-in replacement for the link. But, we don't see anything change. It still works exactly the same. But let's inspect the CSS of this element. What this does is it checks the to. It checks the path to see if we're on the route that this is linking. And if it is, we set the class on this component to active. This is really convenient because now we can add additional CSS styling so that when we're on the active link, it displays something to indicate that. And we can add that easily enough. I can go into app.css and I can grab any A-links with the, not class, the active class, and then I can set, let's say, color to black. And so now when we're on this link, we get to add additional CSS to it, super easy. And there's more prompts we can use to configure the nav link. We can specify the class we want this to add instead of active by default. We can also give it a function that performs the matching, which is useful if we're doing, relative routing. It doesn't have to necessarily match exactly. But that's the fundamental difference between link and nav link, is it allows us to test if our link is the page that we are currently on. And I can change all of these over to nav link. And they're called nav link because generally we want to use this for our navigation links. And so that now as I visit each of these pages, it will show them as black. But here, notice that we still have home. We still have home matching, and that's because it's doing the partial matching. Let's check and see if exact works. Yep, it does. So now we don't get home always showing up as matching within our nav link. All right, did that clear up your question, Amir?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Awesome.
Could you go over match?
On the nav link?
Yes.
Okay. The best way to do that is to Google it and then look up the docs for React Router. So we can see that this has a bunch of props like active class name, which is going to set the active class name instead of active. We can do more things with this, but what we want is the match parameter. Or wait, what param is this under? Is active. So is active is going to be the function that determines if we're matching or not. So I'm going to remove this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a prop called isActive. I'm going to set this equal to a function. And this function takes two arguments, match and a location. And let's just console log those. Because that's the best way for us to learn about what is happening here. So let's check our console. We see we get these two objects. We get our match object, which tells us about the path and the current URL we're on. And then we also get another object with location that tells us about our current location. And every time we perform a routing event, every time we re-render this component, we're going to see these again. So what we can do is perform some logic to check and see if these match. So if I wanted to have an exact match, I could do something like if let's return, we want to return true or false. True means it does match, false means it doesn't match. So I can check to see if match.url is exactly equal to the slash. So now it should match when I'm at the slash, but when I navigate away from it, it no longer matches that. And so that's how we manage the match here. Or did you want to see match as a prop?
I would love to see it as a prop as well.
Okay, awesome. I'm sorry I misinterpreted your questions.
Oh no, I mean that was awesome too.
Okay. Well, that's the same match object we actually get as a prop. So if we go into, let's say, our about component, let's do that. So if we,
Hey Henry, I got a quick question.
Yep.
Before we move on. Same thing with the match. All right, so I noticed in my console, I only have the location. What do you call it?
Object.
Yes. I can't find the match object.
When your console.
Could it be like that you're not selecting the actual components?
Yes, I am selecting the component. I was just reading the directions from yesterday's first project.
Mm-hmm.
It said to highlight the either router.
Oh. Okay, so you're talking about when you're going into the React thing? And you
the React console.
Yeah, you don't see it inside of router. If you look at this router.provider component, which we'll learn more about later, and click on value, you should see that it has the match object there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe it's all right.
Because
sorry, thank you.
Oh no, you're good. React Provider is just it's a special component that allows us to provide data to different components outside of the normal flow of our top-down prompts. So
I don't remember writing that on my code.
You didn't.
Is that like I did?
Yeah, you did not. It's an implementation detail of when we
Okay.
do in index.js, when we wrap
Yes.
our app in this router, which is
Mhm.
actually a browser router, this is going out and setting up some stuff so it can provide all this data to different components.
Oh, so it's
Yeah.
basically implied. Okay.
Yes, this is an implementation detail. It's interesting to see how it works, and we'll learn how it works, but for now, it's more important that we're able to use these components. And this
Gotcha.
also, we'll see these repeated again with this consumer and this provider, and it just works out how to actually share these values with these components, even though we're not passing them directly as props anymore.
Fair enough. Thank you.
All right. So if I go into about and I accept props, because props is the argument that all of our components take, let's console log this. So if I go to my about page and then I check my console, we're going to see our props object contain these three values: history, location, and match. And these are props provided by the React Router library. So we have history, which, as Dan talked about, is kind of this browser feature that tells us all about the history of our thing. And this has various function and properties, like the length. We have member functions that allow us to go backwards and forwards. We have push that allows us to navigate to a new place. This is one option to like trigger navigation inside of a function. Instead of just clicking on a link component, we can use this push function and give it the URL that we want to navigate to. And we also have replace, and so this is our history object. We also have location, which is an object that tells us about the current browser URL, so we don't have to do funky things like try to subscribe to the information of our window. It just gives it to us directly as a prop, which is very nice. And then we also have this match object. This tells us about the match that are, let's go into app.js. It tells us about the match that this route component was able to achieve. So we can see that we have a value called isExact, which is currently set to true because I'm it/about. If I change this to about test, it's still going to report a match, but this time the match is no longer exact. We also have the path, which tells us the path that we're at, and the URL. Or I'm sorry, this path is the path that our component is matching against. Then we also have this params object, which right now is empty. When we add these special values, like $ID or whatever, I'll keep it as ID, but we can call this whatever we want. We're telling the route that I want you to match this route contact/something, and I want you to parse out what that word is for me. So basically, whatever shows up in the URL that comes after the slash, and before another slash or various characters that indicate that we're entering another part of the URL path. So now when I do this, and I check out my match object, we'll see that params is still not. Oh, that's because I did this on the wrong component. So let me do it up here. So now if I do $ID and add this route parameter, we'll see that we have our match, and this params object now has a key called ID and a value of test. So if I console.log props.params.id, I should be able to get whatever value. Oh. Props.match.params.id. Excuse me. I should be able to get whatever value comes after about in the URL here. So I can change this to hello, and we'll see that value hello. I can change it to a 0, and we get 0. Note that these are always going to be strings. Even though I put the number 0 there, this is going to be interpreted as a string because that's what our URL is. It's a big old string. And so we can use this to perform various actions on our page. A very common one is we can specify the ID of some place that we want to visit, like a user's profile or the ID of a movie, and then we can use this within our page to get information about that. So I could add it here. props.match.params.id, and we'll see it come up in our page. So 0, 12, we see that come up. It's very common to use this value, props.match.params.id, or whatever other key that you specify in the route, as an input parameter in an API request that you're making, to get the ID of that user or that movie or something like that. Do you have any other questions? Oh, yes, please.
I had a question on this. So when is the app going to programmatically or dynamically utilize or populate, the routes? Because right now you're manually typing in the route in the URL of the browser, but when would the app actually dynamically set that?
So it would set that whenever we tell it to. Most commonly, we do that using a link. When I click on these links, all I'm doing is changing the URL in my browser. That's really the only thing this link does. It doesn't navigate us to a new page. And so we can use these links to perform other actions. So instead of having a link to about, we can see this isn't showing up because our path no longer matches. We can change, let's say, in our navigation component, the link to instead point to /about to point to /about/12. So now when I click on this link to about, the URL is going to change to /about/12, and I'm going to get that param. We can use variables inside of this too. I saw a lot of people making this mistake yesterday, where they would put backticks here, and they'd say, "Oh, I'm going to be clever. I'm going to use a template string for this, and I'm going to, get an ID from somewhere, like some object.id." And then they'd get this big nasty error and be like, "Well, I guess I can't do that." Template strings are JavaScript, so we would need to wrap this in a set of curly braces. And now our error goes away. Of course, some object is not defined, so I'd have to do that here. But this is a way for us to dynamically generate links to a location. And then when the route performs the path matching, it's going to extract those values for us to use inside of that component. This is perhaps a strange concept. Does that clear up what you're asking, or is it still kind of funky?
Yeah, no, I think that's one use case. It was just a little fuzzy about when would the ID be automatically generated by the app as opposed to manually entering it in. But this is probably a good use case of that.
It's never going to be automatically generated. We have to set the URL of our browser to something. And all this does is it checks the URL of the browser and sets that value for ID. And there might be some way of setting a default value for ID, but generally we're going to create links or perform history.push events to navigate us to a URL that is going to cause this route to recognize and parse out the ID or whatever other values we have in the URL. Any other questions about this?
Yeah, I have a question, Henry. Going back to the routes, when would I know it wasn't required in this project, but when would you use a switch statement? When would be a good time to use a switch around the routes?
That is a wonderful question. So I'm going to change this to just a hard-coded value. So we can use this exact to match only when the path is this route. But we still have this issue of what happens when our routes potentially match multiple things. Like, let's say I have, let me just remove this for now. So let's say I have another component called about to. I have so much information to tell the people about my website that I have 2 about pages. If I navigate to about to, oh, is this gonna work? I don't want it to work. I want this to render twice. What's a good way to get this to break? What if I do this? There we go. So let's say I have about more. So I want to render this other component, which is just coincidentally the same as about, when I'm at /about/more. And normally we do this with nested routes, and this is just a contrived example. But now I'm getting this thing where when we match about, we're rendering that component, and then when we match about/more, we're also rendering that component. I don't want to start littering exacts everywhere, especially in the case where I'm doing nested routing inside of these. So the option is that we can have a switch component. And what this does is this wraps all of our routes, and it's provided by React Router DOM. What it does is it turns these routes from being if statements, if our path matches, render this component, into if else's. If the path matches this component, then render this component and don't do anything else. If it doesn't match, then we can continue down here. But ultimately, the switch makes sure that only one component gets rendered. So now, when I save this file, we'll see that only the first about shows up. And that's because it matched this path. And then it stopped. It stopped checking the other routes to see if they would match. And if I move this up here, we'll see that I get this is going to be the more component. It's not apparent here, but it will only match this component. Doing this is another way we can remove this exact on home. Because now, doing this illustrates why we want to have that exact on home, because when I remove it, we're going to see it matches home immediately and then stops trying to render the other paths. Right? I don't get anything else but home because it matches it right here, and it's going to stop checking for other routes. So that's a place where I absolutely need an exact on home. So switch makes our routes act like if-elses instead of ifs.
So this is analogous to a switch statement in JavaScript, and these are all cases?
Yes, exactly. That's why it's named switch. If you're familiar with the switch statement, it basically allows us to write if-elses in a bit more compact way when we're always checking one variable to see if it equals another value. And it's not entirely analogous, but it's a good way to map those concepts onto each other. So that is a switch statement.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, any other questions on this?
Yeah, so from my understanding about this, it's almost like you either use exact or switch. I mean, yeah, I'm trying to distinguish between the difference between the two still.
Okay, so route, every time we render a route component, it's going to check to see if the path matches, the URL path matches this path prop that we gave to route. And if it does, it'll render that component. But it does so in a vacuum. It is unaware of other routes being rendered on the page, which is why we need exact on our home component. Because if I go to about, it's going to render both home and about. It's going to render both of these because we get 2 matches here. We get the match on this slash, which is a partial match, and we also get match on the about. So we have all of those showing up. And if I add about/more, now we're going to have 3 matches. This match on the slash, this match on about/more, and this match on about. What switch does is switch groups these routes up, so they're essentially aware of one another. And what switch does is it starts checking to see if these routes match from top to bottom. And as soon as it finds a route that matches, it will stop trying to check the other routes. So when I add switch, this is only going to render home. Because it matches, then we're done checking routes inside of this switch component. So switch only renders one component. By default, we'll render as many routes that do match to our URL. But when we add switch, we only do one, and we check this from top to bottom. So we can still use exact and switch in conjunction, because I don't want to match home on any URL. See that I'm at about/more? I don't want to match this in all cases. So I would use exact to say only match this route when we're at the root, when we're at just a single slash. And this will allow me to continue checking to see if I match other routes like about/more. So we still use exact in conjunction with switch. But switch allows us to only render a single component in the case where we have multiple matches. And sometimes we can use it in as an alternative to exact if we have, things like about and about/more. But in general, we can use them in conjunction. They're not exclusive. Does that help clear up your misunderstanding, or would you like to see something else?
Yeah, I think that does.
Okay. Yeah.
That was excellent. You helped me a lot too, and great question, Amir.
Oh, awesome. Okay.
Can I just say something? So in terms of the paths and the switch, so where you have about/more and about, you want to put the more specific ones first.
Mm-hmm.
That way, like when it came to just about, it would stop. So that way you can actually get to the more page.
So let me just make a fake component real fast. I'm actually going to make this render just so, because that's better practice. So now we see we're matching about/more. If I moved this down, we would end up matching about. And that would get matched before about/more, and that would get rendered, not our about/more component, because switch only lets us do one. This is the case where we could use exact instead of switch, where I could say I only want to match about in the case where we're exactly at about. But let's say that we have a case where we want about/more to show up when we're at about/more, but I want about to show up when we're at, about 1 or something like that. So there's flexibility here in terms of the exact behavior we want, and we can use them in conjunction, but they do have different use cases. But generally, yes, when we're using switch, we want our more specific components at the top so that we kind of fall through. And as we don't match the more specific components, we will end up on the less specific ones instead of vice versa, where we end up matching a less specific component before we get to the more specific component that our URL is better tailored to.
Hey, I'm kind of confused. You said you want to be more specific on top?
That's not a hard and fast rule. If we're using a switch, we only get to render one component inside of here. So if I have about first, switch is going to process these in order, top to bottom. So it tries to match home. It's not going to match. Then it tries to match about. This does match. So it's going to render the about component that we see now. It's not going to render this about/more, because even though the URL will match our path, switch shortcuts this. So it is not going to continue to check other routes to see if they match. It's only going to match the first one. So if I wanted about/more to get matched instead of about, I would need to use the ordering, because about/more needs to show up above about in order for it to get matched first.
Gotcha.
But if you put the exact on the third one, the /about, and took out the switch, that would accomplish the same thing.
Yes, if I removed this switch and only wanted to render about when it exactly matches, in this exact case, in this very specific case, this would work. I don't want to mislead you. This is generally not how we want to do nesting of routes. This is just a way for me to contrive this example. If it would be helpful, I can show you how we actually want to do nesting of routes.
Can we go over history.push?
Sure, sure. So, let me remove this for now. And I am going to add a button to my nav. So I'm going to make a button, navigate to home. So let's say I have some on-click behavior of this button. And what I want it to do, oh, this isn't actually going to work in here. I'm going to move this into my About page. So I'm going to add this button that says Navigate to Home. And when this is clicked, I want to do some action. Maybe I calculate some value. Maybe I display some information to the user. Maybe this is the Submit button on my login form, and I want to send the data to my server and then navigate them somewhere else. But I'm using a button. I'm not using a link component. So how do I navigate them to a different place? We can use props.history.push to do that. And in here, I can specify the URL that I want to navigate to. So I can perform whatever actions in this callback that I want to. We clicked the button. And then use props.history.push to add a URL to my history, and it's going to navigate there for us. So now when I click on this button, we will navigate to home, and we also execute whatever other functionality we want to use inside of this callback. So this allows us to perform navigation outside of link or nav link elements.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
The history, is this the browser history is that the stack it's pulling from?
Yes. So
Dan, do you have to visit those URLs for the history or for that URL to be placed into the stack, or is it just automatically in the stack when we load the application?
Yeah. So when we're talking about history, we use the term stack. And a stack is one of our simplest and most friendly data structures. It's something that grows from the end. So it's literally actually an array. And that's why we have the terms pop and push when we refer to removing and adding elements to the end of our array, respectively. So when I look at the history of this tab in my browser, we notice that it's a list. But when I navigate to a new place, I don't add these items to the beginning. You know, it goes in order of the most recent things. So if I navigate to a new place, that will go on top. That will be the most recent place that I've visited. And if I go back, I'm removing that element from the top, and I'm moving to the next one. So these are our pop and push operations, adding stuff to the end, to the most recent end, and removing those to navigate backwards. When we do history.push, we're saying add a new element to the end of our history, and it's going to navigate us there at the same time. It's going to make the current place that we're on equal to whatever value I give this. So that's where we get this overlap in terminology between the implementation details of this being a stack, and then also, you know, this performs our navigation. So similarly, I could make a button and call it go back. And instead of doing, instead of doing history.push, I can do history.pop. And so when we go here, when I click on this button, it will remove where I'm currently at from my history, and it will navigate to the previous place. So when I hit back, oh, why is history.pop a function? Let me check here, props.history. dot. Oh, okay. I guess pop is not a function. They've replaced it with the more reasonably named function go back. So when I click this, I'll now go back.
And that's because history is technically not an array, but it's actually a stack, and then this history stack has its own unique methods.
Yeah, and so we can see in my history in Firefox, this is where we currently are. This is, you know, where we were previously. We've just navigated back one position within the history stack. And so that's where we were, and when I click go back, we've now just gone back one place. So push is essentially navigate to, and then go back is navigate back. And we get these member functions on our history object, and we can check the docs on them, but we can also just see what they are here. Like we also have the ability to go forward.
This is a little out of scope, but I'm just curious. Is there a way to set your stack? Like so that you can do, can you set the maximum stack that you can go, that you can use, or is it just something that browsers control? Can you set your memory for the stack, or is it something that browsers control?
Well, so it is by default set by our browser when we navigate to other pages, but we are allowed to manipulate it. This history object is mutable. So like this length property, I can change it. I can just like cut off a bunch of items from the stack.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's all these other actions we can occur. And you've probably run into this when you've visited a website and you hit back and it breaks because they've implemented their own, you know, essentially history interface, and they've broken the back and forward buttons. And so generally, we don't want to mess with the history too much as a historical record, but we can use it to navigate the user back and forward. There are cases, for example, where you want to perform redirection. So if the user visits, you know, a URL, perhaps a shortened version, and then you want to expand that into a more readable URL, you can use other functions like replace, which is going to allow us to replace our current place in history with a new URL instead of adding another one onto the stack. So we can manipulate this object in whatever way we choose, but I wouldn't do that unless absolutely necessary, because breaking the back button is one of the largest frustrations of our kind of modern SPA web design. That and like breaking scrolling. Like, don't implement your own scrolling. The browser scrolls. Just let them scroll, you know? Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay. Great.
I'm not sure if you answered this already, but what would be the cons of adding exact to every single route in your page?
So that would just make sure that I only match the exact route when we go there. The reason we wouldn't want to do that is subrouting, which I'm going to show you real fast because it's not that complicated. So what I would do is, let's say I want subroutes in about, like about me and about someone else. Let's do my dad. I would just, inside of my about component, I would import route from React router DOM. And I can just have routes in here that will match. And if they match, then they'll render. And I could, you know, wrap this entire about page and you know, do conditional rendering in there. But let's say on about me, I want to show my name. So I'm going to real quick just make a route and have it match Henry. And we'll see more about this in a second. And then here, instead of writing a new component, I'm just going to make one inline. So I'm going to take these props, and then I'm going to render a div. And just put my name in there. And we'll do another one for good old Bard Belvins, which is indeed my father. And so now if we go to /Henry, nothing works, because this path isn't set up to match our current URL, which is actually /about/Henry. So I could do /about/Henry inside of here, and now this works. Henry shows up. But I don't want to hard code this, because then if I change the routing in my app.js, it'll break this component. And that's bad. So instead we can automate this. So what we can do is we can make use of the props dot location, or what do we want? Props dot match dot URL or path. And so now this will match whatever URL we specified in this path, in addition to Henry. And I can do that on Brad as well. Don't go harass my dad on Facebook. So now I have this subrouting set up, so if I go to about/Henry, then that will show up. If I go to about/Brad, that'll show up. And if I go to about/something else, that won't show up. But if I had on here set exact to match this about component, it's going to break. Because my new path is it, about/Henry. That no longer matches purely about. So we've broken our nested routes, which are just more routes that work like other routes. You know, there's nothing fundamentally different between a route that we're rendering here than a route we're rendering there. It's still just basically a nice if statement. If this path matches, then render this route for me. Render whatever component I gave you. We can just use this trick, props.match.path, to match something in addition to the path that we were matching on the parent component, which is a nice way to do subrouting. Does that provide you a sufficient use case, Isaiah?
Of course, perfect answer.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, I try. Any questions about this kind of subrouting?
So what is the props.match.path going to be equal to in this case?
So we can use that in here. We would pass, normally these props to whatever component that we're actually rendering. I will just wrap this in curly braces and return it. This is very bad practice. I am just optimizing for speed here. And so we can console log the props being passed to the Henry component. So let me remove exact, so we end up rendering that component. And we can now see the props for this component. Let's give it a Henry. So this is the object that we're getting from React Router, and we can see we still have our history object. We have our location, which tells us about the current path of our URL, and we have our match object, which is going to show us our URL is it about/Henry. The path that we're matching on this component is about/Henry, and it happens to be an exact match. I could add more stuff, and we would still match, but we're no longer an exact match. And the location is our current URL, and our path is still about/Henry, but now we have an inexact match. We have a partial match.
So what would be the benefit of using a props.match.path as opposed to just hard coding the path in the component?
This makes our component more reusable. Whenever we hard code these kinds of dependencies about where this component is, it becomes brittle. If I decide to change this about here to maybe be like info, then suddenly this would break my subrouting if I had hard-coded about in here. And there's no reason for me to hard-code this because it's literally props.match.path away. It's just like a one-liner. We're just using the variable we have that gives us whatever path we wrote up here. And so now, if I save these changes, if I go to info/Henry, it's still going to work. This doesn't have to have explicit knowledge of the path we matched. And this allows us to make our components more reusable. And another thing is, I'm going to preach about this until the cows come home, which is that I want my components to be functional. Given the same data in, I want the same data out. And when we hard code something like /about in our subrouting, our component is still technically functional, right? There's no side effect, but we're depending on this knowledge that this function doesn't explicitly have. We're depending on our knowledge as a developer, which is dangerous because we're imperfect. We can change things in one place and forget to change them in others, especially if we're collaborating on a project and I don't know how the about page is implemented. What I don't want to do is, if I'm working with people on Build Week, to change this path and then suddenly break the about component, which I've never looked inside of because I never wrote it. This increases the resiliency of our applications so that when given data, they give us the right output. So that's why we generally want to avoid hard coding, is it makes our applications brittle, and it adds these logical code-based dependencies as opposed to these data-based argument dependencies, which are much easier to reason about than trying to remember what you did everywhere. So try to avoid hard coding. It's not essential. You know, if you're in a rush, you know, sometimes you have deadlines, you do what you can to get it running, but it's better to practice best practices now when we have time so that when you are in a rush, it's second nature, so that you can just bang out props.match.path without thinking about it. So try to practice writing resilient, reusable, well-made things when you have time so that it's easier to do them when you don't have time to think about it.
Henry, I understand everything you just explained. What I'm confused about is why, if you did hard code the absolute path and you put about Henry there, it breaks.
So I've changed the route that our about component matches to /info. So if
just the route change breaks it. Okay.
So if I have this you know, /about/Henry, it's no longer going to match because now I'm at /info/Henry. This just allows me to reference the variable of this path on this component. So.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah, great. All right. We have entered your project time. I don't want to take up, you know, that because it's very important for you to work on your stuff. Are there any final questions? Okay. Well, then I will see all of you tomorrow. Thank you so much for showing up. We will go over the entire movies project tomorrow. And good luck.
Appreciate it.
Thank
Have a
you
good
so
one.
much.